Let's be really irritating. Pie in the sky. Why have American and Israeli bombers yet to achieve victory over Iran? This episode in the history of the two countries, and particularly the United States as it's older than Israel, is a 20th century story begun in the wake of the tragedy of the First World War, the trenches, thousands, hundreds of thousands, and in the end millions of men, mainly men, who died in these trenches, fighting these hopeless struggles in no man's land, and the determination of Europeans and Americans after the war to avoid this again. So up came the great innovation of the First World War in some people's minds, not artillery, but aircraft. And this has led to a set of doctrines which we will examine to touch on why the theory of air power, why it is believed in with such religious fervor, and why it so often fails to deliver the goods. Now, in this, not to be heavy-handed, I am very tempted to quote Gore Vidal, that lovable American intellectual, who said his 4 favorite words in the English language were, "I told you so." Now, in this book, c'est moi, I wrote it, I have set this problem out in context to Cambodia. Now, the American bombing of Cambodia, before the regime collapsed, the pro-American regime collapsed in the spring, just before Saigon fell, Phnom Penh fell, the Khmer Rouge swept to power and all that followed. But that's not the point. The point of the American bombardment of Cambodia was the heaviest in the history of the world. More ordnance fell on Cambodia from B-52s than the entire ordnance that fell on the Axis powers in the Second World War, Hiroshima and Nagasaki included. And it did not achieve victory. The Khmer Rouge endured this, the Cambodian people endured this, and the Khmer Rouge swept to victory. Now, at some point in all this, someone needs to sit down seriously with our Air Force generals and say, guys, are you sure this works? Because right now in Iran, and maybe things will be different tomorrow, maybe I'll be sorry that I've argued this way, but in the meantime, it ain't working. And based on the experience of other regimes in Asia, tough regimes, Vietnam, for example, Cambodia, astonishing. Who would have thought the Cambodians could have endured such punishment? Even back to the Chinese and back to the Japanese, which is going to be a painful episode when we sit down and dissect exactly why the Japanese surrendered in 1945, and perhaps it wasn't for the reasons we've all assumed. So, there's plenty of blood to spill, intellectually speaking. But in the meantime, we're going to be very clear that my assumption here, the formidable doctrines of air power developed in the 20s and 30s. There's a famous Italian, which we will talk about. Billy Mitchell in the United States articulated this, and it appears that this has just been such a marvelous boys and their toys thing that American armed forces and their civilian overlords cannot get it out of their heads. The language talked about, Vietnam, for example, the bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong, Nixon, the Cambodia episode, back to China, the whole affair of American bombing during the Chinese Civil War, all this, the same language is used. And the same absence of success has been demonstrated. So something has to give here. And the Iranians, of all people, who would have thought? The Iranians are just, standing man and woman, taking terrible, terrible punishment from the air and not giving an inch. Not so far. So this is where we need to think about this. Hence my suspicion that the air power doctrines of winning wars from the air are probably not true, and therefore to believe them is like believing in Santa, a form of pie in the sky. It doesn't exist. It doesn't work, and it was never likely to work. We need to think again, and the Iranians may force us.